Over the last few days, as the cameras and the politicians left, there were more attempted suicides by young people in Attawapiskat. Tonight, outside health professionals are still there trying to help, but clearly they are facing a daunting task. This is a story that defies our times, but yet is our times. In a moment, some possible solutions to an epidemic affecting too many Indigenous communities in Canada. Joseph Boyden is the author of the award-winning book, The Orenda. Cindy Blackstock is Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And Chelsea Jane Edwards is a youth activist from Attawapiskat, now studying in New Brunswick. Their comments in a moment, but first, some hard facts. If this fact doesn't make you sit up, nothing will. So far this century, more than a quarter of all Inuit deaths in Nunavut have been suicide. 27%. That's not only shocking, it's also one of the highest suicide rates in the world. And for Canada's First Nations population, suicide rates are twice the national average.
What our town's going through right now, it's pretty serious. We could wake up to a call or something saying that we lost one of our young ones or the person that took their own life.
In both Indigenous groups, females attempt suicide more than males. The Canadian suicide average is 4% for females, 2% for males. But look at this, the Aboriginal numbers, 19% for females, 13% for males. Young adults, 15 to 24, form the age group with the most suicides, 5 to 7 times the Canadian average. Bottom line, Attawapiskat is not alone. This is a big problem, and while there are some success stories of Indigenous communities who have turned this horror story around, many are still struggling.
I can't just move away and forget about Attawapiskat. Out there, those people are talking about why can't they just get out of Attawapiskat? Why can't they move away? It's not easy. It's not easy like it looks like.
What to do to change this narrative? Let's try for some answers. All right, I want to get to those answers, but Cindy, you start us off first of all, because we've seen this. I mean, those figures are shocking, but they're not new. We've seen this for decades. Why is it so difficult to turn things around?
Well, I think one of the things is that there is broad-based inequalities on many First Nations communities across all areas of children's experience: education, healthcare, basics like water and housing. And yet many caring Canadians have grown up with the stereotype that First Nations get more, not less. And therefore, we've not dealt with these gross inequalities that pile up on the hopes and dreams of so many First Nations children.
Joseph, let's talk about solutions first in the short term. I mean, we've seen the politicians go in, they're saying all the right things. We've seen healthcare professionals dedicated to trying to help. But aside from that, what has to happen now?
Short term, I think, I saw Charlie Angus go up today with Carolyn Bennett. I think exactly what has to happen right now is to show the community and the communities across this nation that are suffering, we understand, we listen, we care, we want you to do better.
But we've seen people like that go in before.
Exactly, and then that they go and they come and they leave. And what needs to happen is, I think it's a matter of Indigenous people as well as non-Indigenous people in the communities getting together and saying, okay, how do we make a difference? What do we do differently now that will stem this immediately? The long-term picture is a very different thing, but right now it has to be every family looking out for every son and daughter.
Chelsea, what do you think, short term? What has to happen in your community?
First of all, I believe that both federal and provincial governments really need to work together with the community, as well as our partnerships within the community. And I feel that just recently they had established a youth council, so I feel like that will give them the opportunity for them to voice themselves instead of having to have someone to speak for them. And the youth live it. They live it every day in the community in Attawapiskat. They live it all across in First Nations communities in Canada.
One of the things I've heard said is, we need a community center, a youth community center. And you go, they don't have a youth community center?
Yeah.
What does it say about Canada? In 2016, there are communities like that that don't have a youth community center?
Well, this is part of the problem, and again, it's this long-standing misinformation about our First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples, that everyone gets a free ride and everyone is welfare recipient, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't you just go to university if you get a free university education? It's not that simple. It has never been. We have to really fight against this huge tide of misinformation about Indigenous peoples in this country. Many of the communities are rural, and they're not going to, and I know we'll talk about that, they're not going to just pick up and move to the cities. It's nonsensical. What we have to do is focus on these communities that sit often on some of the most rich resources in our country that drives our economy, and it's a matter of sharing the wealth and of proper management of that wealth.
Cindy, what do you think it says about us as a country that there are communities like that that don't have something as simple as a community center for young kids, you know, or a YMCA, YWCA? They don't have it.
I think we've normalized racism in this country, Peter. That we can see it abroad, and we rally together as good, caring people. But in our own society, instead of rallying around ending these inequalities for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, too often we judge them based on misinformation. And I think the opportunity that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is calling us for is, if you have a stereotype, be curious about it. Go look at the facts, because often the reality is much different than what that stereotype would have you believe, and what blocks you from being a caring participant in reconciliation and improving the lives of these kids.
You know, in the opening pack, we saw that one young woman talking about this issue of whether or not they should be moved closer to jobs. You mentioned it as well, Joseph. It came up last week when the former Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, said something. Let me just remind everybody of what he said. Here's what he said last week.
When I quit politics in '84, came back a few years later, I spent a lot of time visiting reserve in northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And it was extremely difficult in that time. It's difficult. There's no economic base there for having jobs and so on, and sometimes they have to move.
All right, now this is a person who actually, you know, he was Indian Affairs and Northern Affairs Minister for a long time. Was very popular among a lot of different people. But he got a real backlash when he said that. Chelsea, what did you think when you heard somebody say that? You know, we've got to move them closer to jobs.
For myself personally, I went off the reserve to get a higher education, even post-secondary and secondary. And for me, that was really difficult. I had to give up my language, my culture, my traditions, my practices. And I feel like I've lost a part of myself. And for the students who have to go off the reserve, I can guarantee that they feel the same way.
But it sounds like such a vicious circle. You know, staying, it's worse than an uncertain future, a future which looks terribly bleak, versus going in some kind of not forced evacuation closer to an area where there could be jobs.
Well, I say end the economic sanctions on reserve, right? Provide people with an equitable opportunity to live in the lands of their ancestors. And culture actually saves children's lives. We know from all the good research done over many years, Peter, there's tons of reports that point to this. The stronger the child's cultural identity, the less at risk they are of suicide. So removing them from the land from which their culture is based actually puts them at higher risk. It doesn't reduce that risk. And so they need to end those inequalities, because they exist if you're living in Ganawage, across from Montreal, or up in Attawapiskat. And then let's see what happens.
Joseph?
And Chelsea is a wonderful example of a young person I've known for years. I've watched her leave her community in order to get a better education, get an education post-secondary. She has told me, I want to go back and make my community stronger by going back in. Because she understands, and I think you have to understand that these are not these places where people are just kind of thrown into this wilderness and survive. This is the homeland for people for thousands of years, and the idea of uprooting them from what I believe is the true medicine that fix almost everything, whether it is environmentally, economically, socially, is all right there on the land. And to move them to cities, to urban areas, I think is a nightmare. I would guess would be a nightmare for most people.
To asking Quebecers to move out of Quebec. It's ludicrous.
Exactly.
Right?
And Newfoundland, you know, there's some economic difficulties there. Let's just move the outport Newfoundland to the big city. It's just, we don't hear that with other groups in Canada. But what we do hear with First Nations too often, and Prime Minister Chrétien, with all due respect, I think that was really a hurtful and unnecessary comment. You know, this is a man who I think spoke off the cuff in a way. I know he's seen the reserves up north, et cetera, but to say that really puts a kind of tells a lot of Canadians something that I don't think that that the Indigenous people in this country need to hear.
Many people think that we've reached a turning point in these last couple of weeks. You know, I'm not so sure of that. Maybe I'm just cynical. It just seems that we've seen so many of these turning points in the past, and here we are still back at it. But if one believes, and I think, Cindy, you do to some degree, that things that we have reached a turning point, convince me of that.
Well, I think it's your viewers who are going to convince all of us of it. Are they going to sit there and do nothing? Or are we going to rise up as a society and demand an end to this racial discrimination that undermines the hopes and dreams of children? I see growing numbers of Canadians coming to that understanding that there are these inequities and doing something about it, but it will need more and more of us to accomplish it. This is our Mississippi. We need to take down that Confederate flag in one fell swoop, not just an inch at a time.
Chelsea, do you have that positive feeling about what's possible now?
One day, we need to, even as Canadians, we need to come to terms and to be educated on our history and our past and what our people had endured. And I feel like that's really important for us to move forward. And Cindy has said that reconciliation does not start with having to say sorry twice. And I feel like that is a really strong message. And I feel like we just have to keep working together and have to understand where we come from, and that maybe perhaps we can rebuild that connection from our First Nations communities with every other Canadian.
Joseph, you get the last word.
I think both Chelsea and Cindy have said it perfectly. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we know what the truth is now, and reconciliation is going to be a long time in the making. And I think and believe that Canada has begun that tide has finally stopped, and we're starting to understand, as we see this tide pull back, what has been left in its wake. And Attawapiskat is that. Attawapiskat is post-generational trauma. It is the spear point in how this country moves forward, the tip of the spear in how we decide to move forward as a nation. Just like our missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country, these are all related, and they go right back to residential schools, and they go right back to how we have treated our Indigenous people for 150 years, if not longer. And it's time for us to move forward together and no more of the blame game and the misinformation. It's time to look after our children and to say, your children are my children. These are our children. I love you. I will bring you into my family. And that is what Canada has to be if we move forward.
All right. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you all.